I'm going to borrow some of these papers. But sooner or later, China will solve those problems. And then the business jet market in China will be the biggest business jet market in the world, just like, hi Rachel, all kinds of friends are here. Just like China is the biggest market in the world for automobiles, for passenger cars. And 30 or 40 years ago, is anyone here from China? Do I have any Chinese students in here? No one? One? 哪一位朋友？你好。从哪里来？Guangzhou. Welcome from Guangzhou. Guangzhou is a very large city. More people live in one of the apartment buildings in Guangzhou than live in in our entire Iron County. 30 years ago, what's your name? Lee. Lee, 30 years ago, if you had wanted to drive a car from Guangzhou to Beijing, could you do it? It would be very difficult, right? There wouldn't have been a highway for sure. If you did do it, you'd have to sort of wind your way there, through cities, around some of the fields, through the countryside. It might take you 3 days, 4 days, 5 days? I don't know. Who knows, right? And now, 30 years later, China, because it's a centrally planned economy, so they made 5-year plans and 10-year plans for what economic sectors they were going to develop. Now you can debate whether or not that's economically efficient, but the fact of the matter is they have built the largest automobile market in the world. They have said that over the next number of years, that time period is in question, that they're going to do the same thing with airplanes. So far the results are disappointing, but I think everybody believes that no one would say within 5 years. I think very few people would say within 10. But once you get out into that 10 to 30 year range, I think most people would say, yeah, sooner or later, China will be the biggest market in the world for airplanes. So let me talk to you about cars for a second. If you were going to go buy a car, how would you choose a car? What are the factors that you consider when you go to buy a car? Anything. 1 word, 2 words. Someone raise a hand and give me an answer.
Cost.
Cost. How much does the car cost? You mean the purchase price or the operating cost? Both. What else?
Gas mileage.
Gas mileage, absolutely. And partly because of cost, partly because maybe you're concerned about the environment or things like that.
Reliability.
Reliability. Is it going to break down all the time? Am I going to pay a lot in expenses? Is it not going to start one day when I need to get to work?
Safety.
Safety, absolutely. That's something I consider when I buy for my wife.
Size.
Size. How many people am I taking with me? Do I have to put my motorcycles in the back, right? Anything else?
4-wheel drive.
4-wheel drive. Where am I going with it? I care a lot about 4-wheel drive, especially here in the winter, right? How about color? Anyone want a puke green car? Why not? Because you'd park it all the way across the other side of the parking lot, so no one would see you drive up in it, right? How about let's say that all the other things are equal. The reliability is about the same, the cost's about the same, the 4-wheel drive is the same, and so forth. But you could get it in a pickup truck shape, you could get it in a sports car shape, you could get it in a sedan shape, you could get it in like a micro box kind of a shape. What would you want to choose? Depends on the style, right? I bet there's a lot of guys in here that just, if you had your druthers, you'd rather drive a big pickup truck, am I right? Or a Ferrari if you really had your druthers. So how would you pick an airplane if you're going to buy an airplane? How would you pick an airplane? These are the sorts of decisions, unfortunately, we don't get to consider as fully or as frequently as we would prefer. How would you buy an airplane? Rachel Pearson, how would you buy an airplane?
It's up to you.
Come on down, we'll hook you up with a Cyberjet SJ30 just down the street. How would you pick an airplane?
I think you would take into account how far you're flying, whether you're taking cargo or passengers, how many international requirements if you're going on borders, security requirements,
exactly.
Where you can fly out of.
All the same things that you would consider, thank you very much, all the same things you would consider when you're buying a car, with a handful of zeros after it, apply when you're picking an airplane. And in airplane terms, they call that the mission. What's the mission that you're trying to fly? Are you trying to fly everyone in the company, the entire board of directors, for a meeting in Moscow? Or are you a real estate investor that has a couple of motels and some restaurants in different counties across rural Utah, and you need to land on dirt airstrips, which is you and one other person, right? Totally different missions. I could buy a pickup truck, I could buy a minivan, I could buy a sports car, I could buy a Ferrari, I could buy a Honda. All those same sorts of things apply. So let's look. Holly, will you help me with the first picture, please? It's probably there. I hope it's there. There we go. BBJ, that's a Boeing business jet, aka a 737. So if you've ever wanted, as maybe the soon-to-be President Trump, if you ever wanted your own airplane, maybe you'd consider a Boeing business jet. What do you think one of these things would run you? A new Boeing business jet. And they sell them green, by the way. Green means they're unpainted and no interior. What would a green Boeing business jet off the lot cost you? Any guesses? No Google. Yeah, $60 million. $60 million roughly. After you've bought it, what's the lowest threshold, the cheapest possible interior, which is done by a third party, right, an aftermarket group? You have to put seats in it in some fashion. What's the cheapest interior you could get in a BBJ? Any guess? Random guesses are fine. About the same as the airplane. About the same as the airplane. So you're looking at well over 100 mil just to get your BBJ flying, because of course you have to take into considerations, do I or do I not need a second sauna in my BBJ, right? I of course would need at least 3 saunas in my BBJ. Holly, will you go to the next picture, please? Is that about what when you think private jet, right? My own airplane, is that kind of what you had in mind? Right? Me, Jay-Z, Beyonce around the table having like fancy dinner. Isn't that sort of what you picture? And for, $100 and something million, this fine aircraft could be yours. Will you go to the next one, please, Holly? Gulfstream 450. What do you think one of those would run you? 45. As it turns out, Gulfstream prices them roughly according to their model number. So a Gulfstream 450 will run you about $45 million. Thankfully, it comes with the interior. A Gulfstream 550 will run you about $55 million. Gulfstream 650 about 65, and so forth. Will you go to the next picture, please? There's what the interior of a Gulfstream 450 looks like. It's up to my standards. It's up to my expectations. I wouldn't be embarrassed pulling up in a Gulfstream 450. What do you think you'd use a Gulfstream 450 for? What would you use one of these for? Let me give you a clue. You wouldn't use it to go land on a dirt airstrip to check out your gas station in Wayne County. What would you use a Gulfstream 450 for?
Tide commercial.
A little louder?
Tide commercial.
Ideally, especially if you're at Procter & Gamble.
I think if you did international dealings and you needed several people to travel on a regular basis, it's big enough, spacious enough to where you can fly that long.
And regardless of how many people you need to get there, a lot of people step up to these airplanes just because they have to travel a long way. They have to go all the way overseas. You'd have to step up to something at least at the Gulfstream 450 level, for instance, if you wanted to fly nonstop over to one of the Asian destinations, Hong Kong or Shanghai or Tokyo or something like that. Otherwise, you have to work your way up across Northern California and Canada and Alaska and try to refuel somewhere in Siberia or North Korea, right? And then work your way back down. It takes a little while. So you'd have to step up to something like this. What would you use a BBJ for? Why would you buy a Boeing business jet? What would that be good for?
Running for president.
Basically, right? That's pretty much what they're good for. You can put everybody in it, and if you need a plane that big to carry your ego, you have other problems. Next picture, please, Holly. That's what we make. That's the Cyberjet SJ30. That's a picture taken down in Las Vegas at the annual trade show. We had just repainted the airplane. We pulled it out onto the tarmac. They call it the static exhibit. It's out at the airport in Henderson, and that's where I got the other pictures as well, because everybody else pulls their airplanes up. You can just kind of wander through the airplanes. I'd always wanted to see what those things looked like on the inside. They open the doors, you wander through all day. Next picture, please, Holly. That's what we look like on the inside. Is this up to your lofty expectations of business travel? It's pretty fancy, right? It looks pretty nice. but it doesn't have your 3 private saunas. It doesn't have that like executive boardroom dining table. It doesn't have all of those big full recliner lazy boys that the Gulfstream 450 has. When you're sitting inside there, it feels a little bit like sitting in like a really fancy minivan, right? In terms of how big the space is around you, kind of how much legroom you have. If there's nobody sitting in these 2 seats in front, this seat, if you pull that tab right there, it'll scoot all the way forward and go back to about this far, and you can put your feet up. So it's nearly a lay flat bed. It's about like having a business class seat on those rear 2 seats. It's pretty comfortable. I like flying in it. It's pretty nice. So why would somebody buy a Cyberjet? We go to the next slide, please, Holly. Look at this for just a second. This one takes just a moment to unpack. This was built by a friend of mine who was kind of analyzing the company. So if you look, let me walk you through a couple of pieces on this. Across the bottom here are airplanes that could plausibly be considered competitors to the Cyberjet SJ30. We only get up to a Gulfstream 150 because there's really no point in comparing our $8 million airplane to what or what not a $100 million Boeing business jet will do. You know, you'd never compare your Honda Civic to a Lamborghini. It just doesn't come up in the same conversation. Nautical mile range. So this is how far the airplane can fly on 1 tank of gas. Anyone know where a tank of gas is in the airplane? Where do they keep the gas? The wings. Yeah, in the wings. There's usually a little bit then underneath in what they call the belly fairings, where the wings kind of attach to the airplane, and sometimes there's some auxiliary fuel behind the seats, but in the wings. So you can see that we fly about 2,500 nautical miles. And you get all the way down here to an Embraer Phenom 100, which is a pretty nice little plane, and it'll take you about 1,200 nautical miles on 1 tank of gas. So we can go twice as far. The bars going up then are the operating costs, a combination of the fixed costs, which is largely your pilots, your hangars, stuff like that, and then the variable costs, the service, and in large portion the cost of fuel. So this chart obviously does us a lot of favors, because if you're looking for range, you're getting a ton of range. You can go a long way in for, comparatively speaking, not a lot of money. In real terms, on an hourly basis, anyone want to take a guess, in just hard costs, if I go out and fly the airplane, the SJ30 for an hour, what's it going to cost me per hour? Those hard variable costs. Any guesses? $1,000. Yep. On average, it's about $1,000. We burn less fuel at high-speed cruise than a Gulfstream, like a Gulfstream 250 burns sitting on the tarmac at idle, just firing the engines up. There's a big difference in fuel efficiency. So the number one reason someone would buy an SJ30 is because they want to go a long way. They don't want to stop and refuel. They want to get there fast, and it's the cheapest way to possibly do it. Holly, we go to the next slide, please. Here we go. Here's the range. I'll go to this side since it's not quite so much behind the screens. This one includes a broader set of potential comparables, because you have to get up to some really expensive airplanes. A Gulfstream 150, of course, will cost you about $15 million, probably $14 million, right, for a new 150. A Citation Sovereign would be more than that, but you have to get up to these big airplanes in order to match us in range. And then when you look down at the other competitors, the range is much less. Here's the way that the costs play out going up, so you can see how much money you'd have to spend to get that additional range. Holly, we go to the next slide, please. Okay, so what does this look like in real terms? In the airplane world, there's been a lot of fuss over the last couple of years about this new airplane coming out from Honda. One, because it's Honda, and number two, because no one ever comes out with a new airplane. It's just way too much money. So a Learjet or a Cessna jet, like a CJ, those airplanes are, they're like multi-generational descendants, right? That there's some original airplane that was a turboprop, some kind of a propeller airplane back in the 60s. And then they modified it a little bit, put an engine on it. And then maybe they did something to the wings, and then they put another new engine on it. And then they stretched the fuselage a little bit. And over the course of time, that's how one airplane this is what the next to each other. Both of these airplanes are housed just a couple of hangars down from each other. And one day, the HondaJet flew from somewhere down here in Mississippi. I don't know where that's from, south of Jackson, all the way back to Cedar. And you know, you can track any airplane you want on FlightAware. You put the tail number in and it shows you exactly where it's at. It took 5 hours and 9 minutes of total time. It stopped once to refuel somewhere here north of Amarillo, Texas. So the total flight time was 4.5 hours. That same route, which is only 1,100 nautical miles, if you ran this out to the Cyberjet's range at 2,000, 2,200 nautical miles, the difference becomes even more stark, right? It would take us 3 hours and 8 minutes of total flight time, and we wouldn't have had to stop even once. So for someone who truly feels that their time is money, you can see kind of what the value proposition is. Of course, the HondaJet's a little bit less expensive. They're about $5 million compared to $8 million for one of ours, but they still would be a theoretical competitor. Next slide, please, Holly. That's Morgan Freeman's actual flight. Of the 4 SJ-30s, he owns one of them. He owns it largely because he lives here in Clarksdale, Mississippi. I'm having lunch with him next week because he's our main customer, right? So we're going into Clarksdale, Mississippi, and he runs a blues club down there called the Ground Zero Blues Club or something. But where's most of his work? Right? Van Nuys, right there outside of Hollywood in LA. You would never fly into LAX because it's just too inconvenient to do that in a private airplane. But you can go into Burbank or into Van Nuys or one of the other airports. So when he flew from the Van Nuys airport this is to Dulles, this is to Washington, D.C. So a cross-country flight. This is exactly how much time it took him. He took off at 8:55 a.m., he arrived at 4:23. The total flight time was, does it say?
4 hours.
Thank you, 4 hours and 28 minutes, coast to coast. Would Morgan Freeman ever fly commercial? Why not? It'd be a mob scene. Can you imagine? The way that we're all detained in security, can you imagine filing through line with Morgan Freeman in front of you? Having him takes off his shoes, gets his laptop out, right? It'd be a total mob scene. So there's no way that he's going to fly a private jet. He travels with one person. He travels with Jimmy. Jimmy is his pilot. Jimmy's his concierge. Jimmy's his personal assistant. Jimmy files the flight plan. Jimmy does some of the basic maintenance on the airplane. He travels with Jimmy. He gets in the cockpit for takeoff and landing. Get up in the air, he goes in the back, stretches the seat out, falls asleep. Gets back in the cockpit when they land, he lands the plane. Technically, he's a licensed pilot. He's not certified on the SJ-30, so he sits in the right seat, in the co-pilot seat, but he participates in takeoff and landing. It's just a lot easier for him to do it that way. We go to the next slide, please, Holly. So when he was promoting, what's the, Invictus, right? Anyone seen Invictus? It's a pretty good movie. When he was promoting Invictus, and filming, he went all around the world. So you can see the SJ-30 takes him coast to coast, across the Atlantic. Technically, we can also make it over if you wanted to go up to England or somewhere like that. Took it all through Africa. These are all of his trips when he was filming and promoting that movie. This is him here in Cedar City when we had an anniversary and groundbreaking celebration, and he decided to show up, and he spoke and talked about how much he liked.
Holly, next slide, please. How'd the SJ-30 end up in Cedar City? So I'm the CEO of this holding company, MSC Aerospace, that has 3 divisions: Metalcraft, Cyberjet, Cedar Building Associates. Holly, next slide, please. Here's Metalcraft. We're a metal fabrication factory. So largely aluminum, some titanium, some stainless steel. We built almost all of the titanium parts, for instance, on the F-22, when that was still in production for the military. We have over 2,000 pieces on the 747. So basically any Boeing airplane that you've ever flown on, we make tons and tons of the little metal pieces that are required to do it. So that's like axis milling and lathe work and bending and sheet metal, tube bending, all of those sorts of things. We've gone from little pieces to sub-assemblies to larger assemblies, and that's what it looks like out on the shop floor. Holly, next slide, please. And the people that we sell to then, our 2 biggest by far, Boeing and then the military. We're about 50-50, which is a pretty good balance because the market kind of goes back and forth. But we sell to all these other, to Gulfstream, to Learjet. CPI does a lot of Boeing work. We sell to Lockheed Martin. Middle River does a lot of, that's General Electric. They do parts for engines for General Electric. Next slide, please, Holly. A-10 Warthog. These great big engines. It's basically like a flying tank, right? It's slow. It flies low over the battlefield, and it has these huge machine guns up front, literally for like strafing tanks on the battlefield. So it does battlefield support for the ground troops to kind of clear the way so that they can march through after. The military's been doing those for, anyone know how long? They've been around forever. 60s? Yeah. They've been around since the Vietnam War for sure. So it's an old airplane, but they haven't found a better or cheaper way to do it. So like all these other airplanes, rather than design a brand new one, they just keep changing something, adding something, and they're doing some new engine work on it. So we won the contract to build that body work around the engine called the engine nacelle. In terms of a one-time contract in metalcraft, that's one of the biggest one-time contracts we've ever won, and that's a lot of the work that we're doing over there right now. Holly, next slide, please. So let's see. I think I'll just try to tell this story. This slide might take a second. You're welcome to try to read along, but here's the brief history. Our chairman, who's serving as a mission president right now for the LDS Church in Croatia, he comes back next June. He was, years ago, when he was probably in his late 30s, he was the Utah State Economic Development Director for Governor Bangerter. And when he was there, he was instrumental in bringing a major aerospace company to come manufacture in Utah. I think it was McDonnell. It may have been McDonnell Douglas. I don't remember exactly where the merger came in. And once they were here, I think for tax and various reasons, they said it would be a lot more efficient for us to be able to buy parts and source parts directly here in the state. But there was nobody qualified to build parts for McDonnell. So one day, David Grant came down here to Cedar City. You know, what's the new name of Weco after Huntsman bought it? The chemical plant makes American Pacific, right? So thank you, Holly. I think it's called American Pacific. They make oxidizer for rocket fuel. It's way out on the west side of town. They originally had a plant out in Henderson, Nevada. You can put this on YouTube. This was years ago, 30 years ago, had a huge industrial disaster. I mean, this massive explosion, at which point they decided not to operate the factory in Henderson anymore, and it moved out to the west side of the desert. David Grant, our chairman, came down here for that opening. While he was at the opening, the original employees, 40 of them or something, at Metalcraft, it was called Morton Metalcraft at that point, came over and said, our parent company out of Indiana is going to shut the factory down. They made two things. They made slot machine spare parts, replacement parts, and they made wire gift card retail display racks for Hallmark. That was what their product. Oh, I think they made some old desktop computer cases as well. And they said Morton Metalcraft is going to move everything back to Morton, Indiana. We're going to lose 40 jobs in Cedar City. What are you going to do about this? So David Grant went to McDonnell Douglas and said, if I buy this factory, because his term was about finishing as the economic director, if I buy this factory, would you come in and write the operating manual and give us our first order to turn it into an aerospace factory? So they said yes. So he finished the meeting at Weco, finished his job a few weeks later, however long it was up in Salt Lake, and came down and bought Metalcraft. And within 1 year, they had transitioned out of slot machines and wire gift card display racks and computer cases and so forth, and it had transitioned into aerospace parts. And so from there, it was just 1 year after another. It's grown bigger and bigger and more complicated, 27, 28 years later since that happened. Along the way, let's see, down here is the SJ-30. There's a gentleman named Ed Swearingen. He's in the Aerospace Hall of Fame down in Texas. He just passed away a couple of years ago to ripe old age, 90-something years old. Apparently was a classic old guy. And he had designed tons of airplanes. He was one of the original designers for Learjet. He made a lot of money designing an airplane called the Metroliner. And he wanted to design this specific long-range airplane in conjunction with Williams engines. Williams made one-time use engines for missiles, used one time. And they wanted to transition into these long-term use engines. So they said, let's do this super light, super efficient, light business jet. And they started designing this thing. So he then went about raising a bunch of money. Most of the money came in from the Taiwanese government. And somewhere along the line, here we go, 1998, we became one of the suppliers to the program. By 2006, we were doing full Fuselage assemblies for the company manufactured 70% of the airplane, were by far the biggest supplier. And in 2011, the company changed hands once. The SJ-30 program changed hands once when the Taiwanese government changed and made a political decision to divest of the program. They sold it to a group in the Emirates, so it became called Emivest Aerospace. And in 2011, Emivest, which was largely a real estate investment fund, was borrowing money against their Dubai real estate in order to invest into Cyberjet. And when the market crashed, they ran out of money, went bankrupt, and as the largest supplier, we bought them out. That's how the SJ-30 ended up in Cedar City. Next slide. What did we get when we acquired the program? Number one, there's only one piece of intellectual property in a jet program. It's called the type certificate. Everything underneath the type certificate is wrapped in that. There's 18,000 parts on the bill of materials. There's 8 miles of wire that run through the airplane to have everything talk to each other electronically. All of those parts are under one piece of intellectual property that we don't even have to enforce. The FAA, the US government, enforces it for us. We got that type certificate. I'll show you how much that might cost if we were going to start from scratch, right? Why are there no clean sheet programs? We got all the manufacturing tools, all the assembly jigs, all the parts, to go build a bunch more airplanes. In some cases, out to 40 airplanes worth of parts were in inventory. We owned 1, 2, 3. We got 3 airplanes, plus we bought another. We have 4 SJ-30s and all the flight test equipment. We got works in process, so a bunch of partially completed airplanes. And there had originally been 248 orders on the books, which is roughly 2 years of the entire market in light jets and smaller mid-sized jets. It was an enormous amount of interest in the program. That's what we got when we acquired the SJ-30. So here's another guess. If you were going to start from scratch to develop something like the SJ-30 or the Honda jet, hire a bunch of engineers, start buying parts, start going through the checks with the FAA, from start to finish, how much would it cost? How much would it cost?
$1 billion.
At least $1 billion. How long do you think it would take you? At least 10. 10 for sure. And most people fail along the way. Next slide, please, Holly. Here's the last 3 examples. There's the Honda. They've been at it for over 17 years. Estimates vary. And this is just Business Week, right? You Google and see what people are estimating. They think they've spent probably close to $2 billion. And there's still some portions of the certification that they're working on. They can sell the airplanes, but they'll increase the flight ceiling, or they'll increase other things that it's certified to do. Bombardier, Learjet, they spent $1.5 billion on a mid-size composite airplane, and after doing a couple of flight tests on it, concluded that it's dog don't hunt. The plane just didn't fly. And it's not public knowledge, but we talked to the engineers who did it. The plane just didn't fly. So they canceled the whole program, wrote it off. It's completely mothballed. Comac is the Chinese commercial airplane developer. They spent $1.2 billion, over 13 years. They actually, since this was made, I think, have just certified it in China, which that means they can sell it to Pakistan and North Korea. No one else will take a Chinese certification at this point. But they'll probably end up getting it certified somewhere else. And it's supposed to compete with the 737, but it's not even remotely as efficient, so no one would ever buy one anyway. So we got quite a bit of intellectual property when we made the acquisition. Next slide, please, Holly. Oh yeah, here's what we've got. So here's the 4 airplanes. Here's Morgan Freeman's airplane. This one lives mostly in Costa Rica, although it's down in St. George a lot of the time right now. This one belongs to a restaurant guy down in Las Vegas. And there's our airplanes. There's four that had been delivered prior to our acquiring the program. So our job is to turn the supply chain back on and start manufacturing again. Next slide, Holly. So here's what we're going to do. The current airplane up here at top is called the SJ-30-2. We're going to build the SJ-30I, which is that same basic airplane, but with new avionics. I mean, all touch screen and all kinds of new functionality in the system that drives the airplane. And then on top of that, we'll put a new engine on it, call it the SJ-30X. It'll go a little bit faster, it'll go a little bit farther, and it's a lot more efficient in certain performance parameters. And these are just mock-ups of some of the pictures we've taken as we've been mocking up interiors and so forth. Next slide, please, Holly. Here's what we look like. That's the SJ30-2's cockpit. And then the next one, here's what we upgrade it to. And that's an actual picture of the working system in our trade show mock-up. The one system, these 4 touch screens and then all of the electronics that control the airplane, one system costs about $500,000 just to acquire it and put it in there. It's a very expensive trade show mock-up. Next picture, that's our old interior, and our new interior looks like that. And then one more, please, Holly. And then the other change that we'll make, anyone know where the bathroom is in this thing? It's like an RV toilet. So if you lift this seat up right here, there's a chemical potty underneath there. This smoked glass, it actually completely closes and then smokes on this side and on the cockpit side. So it's completely private, but it's tight quarters. It's as good as anything else you'd get at an $8 million price range, but it's fairly tight quarters. The old potty seat used to be right here, facing this way. So when you sit down, the fuselage of the airplane is kind of curling around behind you, and you can't really lean back. It's not that comfortable. So we take these seat mechanics, because they're certified. Every bolt has to be certified. We turn the seat around, one of these seats, and put another one here, put the potty underneath it, and then thankfully we had already certified 2 separate windows, so we get a lot more space out of the airplane. Next slide. This one's kind of fun, because this shows that progression for what could we do with the program now that we own it. So up there at the top, that's the SJ30-2. Go to the next one, that's the SJ30I. So it's the SJ30-2 plus the new avionics system. SJ30X is then that same airplane plus the better engines. Then the SJ30X, we just call it the GF internal, the Go Fast. We take that engine, it has additional capability, and we go through a bunch of additional testing to certify that additional thrust, so we can do all kinds of things. So we can go faster, we can go farther, we can climb, but we have to go through a bunch of testing to do that. Then we could go to an SJ40, which would be the same airplane, but they would stretch the fuselage out, just add an extra row of seats, so you could get 2 more people in there. Then we could go to an SJ40X, which would be a longer fuselage plus a bigger wing to be able to support that kind of lift, plus a little bit more engine. We'd go to the next engine up, and all of a sudden you'd have something you could put 10 people on, and you could be the fastest thing ever to go to Hawaii. It would be an amazing airplane. Then we could go 2 different directions. We could go to an SJ50, which is a complicated change. To take the fuselage and make it longer is relatively easy. To take the whole fuselage and change the structure to make it wider so you can stand up in it, that's a tough change. But we could go that direction. Or we're the only existing fuselage, in other words, they call it a certified pressure vessel, right? An operational airplane fuselage that with an existing certified engine could go supersonic. That would mean you could call your buddy in Hawaii and say, I'll meet you for lunch in 2.5 hours from Cedar City. That would be a real airplane. Next slide, Holly. This is how it would work. SJ30I, X, the new engines. SJ40, so you have to have a little bit of additional wing underneath you, plus a little bit more seat space. The SJ40X, a little bit more space, plus new engines. Next slide, Holly. And then if we were going to go to the SJ50, you'd need a lot more wing, plus a bigger diameter of the fuselage. Or here's the existing piece of the SJ30. We're the highest pressurized, it's set the record for the most pressure in the cabin in an airplane. So for instance, when you fly in a commercial jet, you're flying up at 38,000 feet, and you fall asleep because the relative altitude is 8,000 feet, 8,500 feet. So you're tired just like if you're hiking, way up high in the mountains, there's not that much oxygen. When we're at 38,000 feet, it's sea level. So in other words, when you get in the airplane here in Cedar City, we have to depressurize the cabin to match the local air pressure, and then as we climb, we repressurize it because we can get so much more oxygen in there. That's the part that we could keep if we were going to do a supersonic, but we'd have to do the trapezoidal wing and so forth. What do I have next, Holly? I think we're probably about there. So there's the airplanes that are in process, starting from the one that's the most complete. These top 3, they're down at our engineering office in San Antonio right now. This is going to be the first SJ30I. It's basically done. We're just trading software packages with Honeywell right now to make sure that we can start it flying. And then these 2 are close, 70% complete, 80% complete. And then this is all the stuff that's in the factory here in Cedar City. This factory is operating, is fully running, but they're only building one thing right now for the SJ30, and that's the 8 miles of wire. So when we put the new avionics in, first they have to design how that wire talks to all the electronics and control surfaces in the airplane, and then build the actual wire harnesses, which is, it's literally like handwork. We've had loads and loads of support from SUU. At the President's Banquet the other night, you guys talked about Zuken, the engineering software packages. They donated software so that students here get trained, they come over and work for us, then they build the wire harnesses. It's been a great relationship for us and very helpful. And then the next point on this slide then would be that once these are delivered, you can't really disassemble those airplanes and move them to Cedar City. So once those first 3 are done, then everything else happens here in the factory in Cedar City. And we'll go from doing the wire harnesses to then continuing to run the whole manufacturing floor. Everything is completely set up. All of these tools and jigs and so forth that you see here, it's like a just add water operation. Skip the next slide, Holly, and then go to the last one. So when we're all done, so this is the overview of what you're looking at. Here's the Highway 56, and then Airport Road, right? If you kept driving down that, you'd get out to the terminals. So we'll end up building, when we need the space, this completion and delivery center right here. You can see that the runway connects to our driveway. This is where I work in our Plant 1, and then just off the freeway, it's relative scale, just off the freeway is where all the Cyberjet airplanes are manufactured, those pictures you just saw. And eventually this whole piece of property out here that we own, we'll build buildings here. We could end up building one out here. This is where the whole campus ends up. That I thought would be more interesting in terms of an entrepreneur class to tell you an actual story about the business than to tell you anything else. And I notice it's 12:21. Dean Templin, Tyler, who's in charge in here? Should I ask for questions?
Yes.
Questions? Is there anything you'd like to know?
So you currently have 4 airplanes out, and you talked about how you acquired some backlog of orders. Do you have a lot of orders?
All of the orders were canceled except for 2. Not because we canceled them, but because literally these people had placed, for instance, the Dolby family, Dolby Sound, had paid $5 million towards one of these airplanes. It was almost finished. The old company declared bankruptcy. That's how bankruptcy works. They lose their $5 million. So no, all of those orders were completely wiped out. I think the general attitude in the market right now, speaking candidly, is that having watched this happen not just to the SJ30 program, but to other small jet programs like the Eclipse, so many people have lost so much money in upfront down payments that I don't think anyone's going to give us any more money basically on orders until we've actually certified that new model and start delivering. So we channel all of our investment from one business, from making parts for Boeing in the Defense Department. We just reinvest the profits over into the other side, and we're doing it on our own. Then we'll turn the whole thing on again. Tyler?
So I think I understand how you might keep your variable cost down through more efficient engines, but the fixed cost, that's your operational cost. Your fixed operational costs are lower too, right?
Are you thinking from the point of view of an end user?
Yeah.
From someone who's buying an airplane? Right. There's basically 2 types of customers. There's people who are buying purely for the size of the airplane. They don't fly very far. It's how can I stand up in it? How many people could I sit in it? And there's people who buy for range. So for instance, here's another random statistic. What's the average passenger load of any business jet, any type of a flight in the United States? How many people are on it, on average?
86%, I think.
Well, in terms of people.
6.
2.5. I don't know how half a person gets on the airplane, right? But it's 2.5 people. So basically people who want range are stepping up to these airplanes where they burn way more fuel. You have to have 2 pilots. Everything's more expensive about them, but they just want to have the range. So part of the theory behind the airplane is that we're way more efficient than something that costs twice as much. But if somebody says, well, I got to take 8 people with me, they'd never buy our airplane. In the same way that somebody who wants to buy a minivan would never accidentally buy a Turbo Carrera. And we're not even really like buying a Turbo Carrera. We're like buying like a Lotus or like a McLaren, like something kind of weird, kind of rare. Because when you pull up, and there's people who care about this kind of thing. I didn't know. Here, I'll tell you a random story. I know I'm running over time, but before I worked full-time at the company, I was helping the company with meetings with a potential investor. They were Chinese. I was hosting these guys. And it turned out they wanted to meet on the day of my 20th high school reunion in Southern California. And David Grant, the chairman, who was still in town, said, you've got to be at these meetings. I'll fly you to your reunion. So we were at Lake Powell. I literally got out of the off the ski boat and walked up the hill in Page, Arizona, right, to the airplane and got on in a wet bathing suit and flip-flops and flew from Page, Arizona into John Wayne Airport, into Irvine, where I'm from. And they see private airplanes there. And when we pulled in, no one had ever seen an SJ-30 before. So everyone in the terminal walked out. The door opened, and I walked off in a wet bathing suit. I've never been treated so weird in my whole life. I don't know who they thought I was, but I was a total imposter. And for people who care about this kind of thing, it's cooler to pull up in a McLaren or a Lotus than like a stock model Porsche. And that's kind of how this airplane plays. Does that sort of answer your question in a longer way? Anyone else? Any other questions? Please.
From the time you got, after you got both your degrees to this job now, how many jobs have you had in between?
I practiced law for about 9 months with no intention of being a lawyer, really. And then I went to Polaroid, and that was that would be, I could do a whole nother presentation on that one. It turned out that the guy who was like the boss of the boss of the boss, I'll just tell you the punchline, we found out long after we were all gone, had on the side been running what turned out to be the 3rd largest Ponzi scheme in the history of the United States. He'd stolen $3 billion from like Goldman Sachs, from like crazy people. But he didn't get any press. He lost out because he did it at the same time as Bernie Madoff, so no one paid any attention to him. But we were running Polaroid. At that point, it was a group of, I'm LDS, I speak Chinese, I served my mission in Taiwan, and a bunch of my mission buddies and I, there were like 6 of us, were sort of the first group in our late 20s to go into some of these Chinese factories that were not Taiwanese owned. They were local Chinese factories. But it was the same talent base of engineers, the same supply chain, and then we were leading the Walmart teams and the Best Buy teams and so forth in to do sourcing before they had their own sourcing teams. And we built almost $1 billion worth of sales a year in just under 4 years. And then because of obviously other factors that we couldn't figure out what was going on, the company was going to blow up, and we all left. And then 9 months later, this boss got arrested, and we're like, wow, that was quite a story. So I went to that job for about 5 years, and then that created a lot of problems. There's a lot of ups and downs in being an entrepreneur. And so I basically was like what I call self-unemployed up in Salt Lake City. I did a bunch of stuff. I was consulting. I started a handful of consumer products groups. I brought in enough money to pay the rent and support my family, but I wasn't really making a lot of money, but I was doing okay. I could pay the bills. And one of the companies I ended up consulting for was Metalcraft Cyberjet. And so when the chairman then went, I did that for 5 years or so, and when the chairman then went on to serve as a mission president in Croatia, he needed someone to work at the holding company level to kind of manage the business development, the finances, and that was when I moved to Cedar City. Questions? Maybe about there. Thank you all.